This episode was produced using AI-generated voices and scripting. All right, so today we're talking about Waymo and the fact that self-driving taxis are apparently going mainstream way faster than most people expected. Matt, I feel like this snuck up on everybody.
It really did. And I think part of the reason it snuck up on people is that we've been hearing about self-driving cars for so long, like over a decade at this point, that most people just tuned it out. It became this perpetual 5 years away technology, like fusion energy or whatever.
Right, the boy who cried autonomous.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Waymo's been quietly racking up ridership numbers that are genuinely staggering. They crossed 150,000 paid rides per week earlier this year. And that number's been climbing fast. Like, it roughly doubled from where it was less than a year before that.
Wait, 150,000 a week? Paid rides, not test rides?
Paid rides. Real customers pulling out their phones, hailing a Robotaxi, getting in, going somewhere and paying for it. No safety driver in the front seat. This is a fully commercial service operating at scale.
Okay, so put that in context for me. How does that compare to like an Uber or Lyft in a major city?
So it's obviously still a fraction of what Uber does globally. Uber's doing millions of rides a day worldwide. But if you zoom into the specific markets where Waymo operates, it starts to look really significant. In San Francisco, for example. Waymo's reportedly handling a meaningful percentage of the rideshare volume. In certain neighborhoods, they're not a curiosity anymore. They're a transit option that people are choosing regularly.
And they're in, what, 4 cities now?
Yeah, San Francisco, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Austin. And they've announced plans for more. Atlanta, Miami, they're expanding. The Phoenix operation's been running the longest, and that's the one that's really mature. But San Francisco's the one that gets the most attention because it's such a dense, complicated driving environment.
Yeah, San Francisco's got those insane hills. The double-parked delivery trucks, cyclists everywhere.
Exactly. And that's actually a really important point because one of the long-standing criticisms of Waymo was that they were cherry-picking easy environments like Phoenix suburbs, flat roads, wide lanes, good weather, grid layout. And critics would say, sure, you can do self-driving there, but that doesn't prove anything.
And now they're doing it in San Francisco, which kind of blows that argument up.
It does. I mean, San Francisco is genuinely one of the hardest driving environments in the country, and the cars are handling it. Not perfectly, we should talk about the edge cases, but well enough that people are using the service daily, and the city hasn't shut it down.
Okay, so let's talk about the edge cases. Because I still see videos on social media of Waymo cars doing weird stuff, like stopping in the middle of intersections or getting confused by construction zones.
Yeah, and those videos are real, they happen. But here's where I think people's intuitions mislead them. You have to compare Waymo's error rate not to perfection, but to human drivers. And humans are terrible drivers. We kill over 40,000 people a year on American roads. We drive drunk, we text, we fall asleep, we road rage. The bar is not 0 mistakes. The bar is fewer mistakes than humans. And by that metric, Waymo's actually doing remarkably well.
Do we have actual safety data on that?
We do. Waymo published a study, I think it was with Swiss Re, the big reinsurance company, looking at their first millions of miles of autonomous driving compared to human baselines. And they found significantly fewer injury-causing crashes. I want to say it was something like an 85% reduction in injury-causing crashes compared to human drivers in the same areas. Now, you can quibble with the methodology, and some people have, but the direction of the data is pretty clear.
Interesting. So even with the weird intersection thing or the occasional confused stop, the overall safety picture is better than what we'd get from humans.
That's what the data suggests. And think about it this way. When a Waymo car does something dumb, someone films it and it goes viral. When a human driver does something dumb, it's just Tuesday. There's a massive asymmetry in how we notice and report these incidents.
Oh, totally. The availability bias thing.
Right. And it works against Waymo in public perception, even when the numbers are in their favour. Every single Waymo incident gets scrutinised in a way that we'd never apply to human driving, which honestly is probably fine from a regulatory standpoint. We should hold autonomous systems to high standards, but it does distort how people think about the technology's readiness.
So let's talk about the business side, because Waymo's been spending an astronomical amount of money for years, right? This is Google money, Alphabet money, and just pouring into this. Is it actually a viable business yet?
Not yet profitable, as far as we know. Alphabet doesn't break out Waymo's financials in a ton of detail, but the investment has been enormous. We're talking billions and billions of dollars over more than a decade. The vehicles themselves are expensive. Each one's loaded with custom LiDAR, radar, cameras. The sensor suite alone costs a fortune, though that cost has been coming down.
Do we know what a single Waymo vehicle costs to build?
They haven't disclosed exact numbers recently, but estimates have been in the range of $150,000 to $200,000 per vehicle when you include all the sensor hardware and compute. Compare that to a regular car that a rideshare driver would use. You're talking maybe $30,000 to $40,000, so the upfront cost is way higher. But, and this is the key insight, you don't have to pay the car a wage.
Right. No driver means no labor cost, which is like 60 to 70% of a rideshare fare.
Exactly. And the car can theoretically operate 20 hours a day. A human driver's doing maybe 8 to 10 hours, and then they go home. So you get way more utilization out of each vehicle. The math starts to flip when you hit certain scale thresholds. You amortize that higher vehicle cost over way more rides because the car's running almost continuously.
So at what point does it become cheaper per ride than Uber?
That's the trillion-dollar question. Some analysts think Waymo's already approaching cost parity in their most mature markets, at least on a per-ride marginal cost basis. The fully loaded cost, including R&D, is still underwater. But if you just look at the cost to operate one vehicle that's already built and deployed, it's getting really close. And as the fleet scales and sensor costs keep dropping, the economics only get better.
Which is probably terrifying if you're Uber or Lyft.
Well, it's complicated, because Uber actually partnered with Waymo. They've got a deal in Austin and Atlanta where you can hail a Waymo through the Uber app. So Uber's kind of hedging. They're saying, look, we might not build the autonomous tech ourselves, but we'll be the marketplace where you book these rides.
That's smart, actually. They become the platform layer regardless of who's driving, human or robot.
Very smart. It's basically the Uber playbook from day one, right? They don't own the cars, they don't employ the drivers. So if the driver becomes software, Uber can still be the intermediary. Whether that actually works long-term is another question, because Waymo has its own app and its own brand, and consumers are increasingly going directly to it.
So what about the competitive landscape? Because we've got to talk about Tesla here. Elon's been promising robotaxis for years.
Yeah, so Tesla's approach is fundamentally different from Waymo's, and I think this is one of the most important distinctions people miss. Waymo uses a multi-sensor approach. LiDAR, radar, cameras, all working together to build a detailed 3D model of the world around the car. Tesla's approach is vision only, cameras and neural networks, no LiDAR.
And Elon's argument has been that humans drive with just vision, so cars should be able to as well.
Right, that's the argument. And it's not a crazy argument on its face. But, and I'm going to take a strong position here, I think the evidence at this point overwhelmingly favours the multi-sensor approach for full autonomy. Tesla's full self-driving system is still level 2. It requires a human driver paying attention at all times. Waymo's operating at level 4. No human in the loop. No safety driver. In defined areas. Those are worlds apart in terms of actual capability and liability.
That's a big claim. You don't think Tesla can close that gap?
I think they might eventually. I'm not saying vision only is impossible, but Tesla's been saying they're 1 year away from full autonomy for about 6 years now. Meanwhile, Waymo's actually doing it every day, with paying customers. At some point, you have to weight demonstrated capability over promised capability. And right now, Waymo's the only company in the US operating a large-scale commercial robo-taxi service without safety drivers.
Fair point. What about Cruise? They were GM's self-driving unit, and they had a pretty rough time.
Cruise is a cautionary tale. They were operating in San Francisco, actually looked like they were going to be a real competitor to Waymo, and then they had that incident in late 2023, where one of their vehicles dragged a pedestrian. And more importantly, there were allegations that Cruise leadership wasn't fully transparent with regulators about what happened.
Which is basically the worst thing you can do in a regulated industry.
Exactly. The technology failing is one thing. Regulators understand that accidents happen, but if you lose their trust by being evasive or misleading, that's existential. Cruise got its permits pulled, the CEO resigned, GM slashed their funding, and the whole operation basically imploded. They've been trying to regroup, but they lost years of momentum.
So that kind of highlights how fragile this whole thing is from a regulatory perspective, right? Like one bad incident could set the entire industry back.
It absolutely could. And Waymo knows this. I think that's actually one reason they've been relatively conservative about expansion. They want to make sure every new market launch goes smoothly, because the political and regulatory risk is enormous. If a Waymo car killed a pedestrian in a way that was clearly the technology's fault, you could see cities banning robo-taxis overnight.
Has Waymo had any fatalities?
No, not as of the most recent data, which, given the millions of miles they've driven, is actually a really strong record. There have been minor collisions, fender benders, that sort of thing, but no fatalities. Compare that to the roughly one fatality per 100 million miles for human drivers in the US. Waymo's driven well past that threshold without a fatal crash.
That's a pretty compelling data point.
It is, though I'd add the caveat that Waymo operates in controlled conditions. Good weather, mapped areas, specific times. They're not driving on rural highways in a snowstorm. The conditions are curated, but still, millions of miles with no fatalities in complex urban environments is meaningful.
Let's talk about the user experience for a second. Because I've taken a Waymo ride and it was kind of surreal. Have you done one?
I have, yeah. In Phoenix. And it's funny that the first couple of minutes are genuinely strange. You get in, there's no one in the front seat, and the steering wheel just starts turning by itself. Your brain kind of short circuits for a moment.
Yes. And then like 5 minutes in, it just feels normal. Like you stop thinking about it.
Totally. And that normalization is actually the most important thing happening right now. Because the biggest barrier to adoption isn't the technology, it's psychology. People are scared of the concept, but once they try it, most of them are fine with it. Waymo's own data shows that repeat ridership is very high. People who try it tend to keep using it.
And I've seen people online saying they actually prefer it to a regular Uber. No awkward small talk, no weird driving, no phone mounted on the dashboard blasting music.
The consistency is a big thing. Every Waymo ride is basically the same. Clean car, climate controlled, no judgment about your destination, no driver trying to take a longer route. It's weirdly peaceful, and for certain demographics, women riding alone at night, for instance, there's a real safety appeal to not having a stranger in the driver's seat.
Oh, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that angle.
Yeah, it comes up a lot in user surveys. The feeling of personal safety in the vehicle is actually rated higher for Waymo than for traditional rideshare by a significant margin among female riders. Which makes sense when you think about the number of incidents that have been reported with rideshare drivers over the years.
Okay, so let's get into some of the harder questions. What does this mean for jobs? Because there are a lot of people driving for a living in this country.
This is the uncomfortable part, and I don't think the industry talks about it honestly enough. There are roughly 300,000 taxi and rideshare drivers in the US. There are about 3.5 million truck drivers. If autonomous driving technology scales, and the rideshare side is clearly scaling now, those jobs are at risk. Not all at once, not overnight, but the trajectory is clear.
And these aren't jobs that require a college degree. They're accessible to a huge portion of the workforce.
Right. And that's what makes this different from, say, AI replacing some white-collar knowledge work. Driving jobs are often the job of last resort for people who need income now. Immigrants, people between jobs, people who need flexible hours. If you remove those jobs, you're not just disrupting an industry. You're pulling away an economic safety net that a lot of people rely on.
So what's the answer? Do we slow the technology down to protect jobs?
I don't think that works. Historically, trying to slow down technology to protect incumbent jobs almost never succeeds long term. And honestly, I'm not sure it's morally right either, because we're talking about a technology that demonstrably saves lives. If autonomous vehicles really do reduce traffic fatalities by 80 or 90%, you're weighing job displacements against tens of thousands of lives saved every year. That's a brutal trade-off.
Yeah, you can't really argue for keeping people dying in car crashes so that rideshare drivers can keep their gigs.
No, but you can argue that the transition needs to be managed. Retraining programs, safety nets, maybe some kind of transition fund. Like what we talk about with coal miners and clean energy. The technology is probably coming whether we want it to or not. The question is whether we handle the human impact thoughtfully or just let it happen and deal with the wreckage after.
Let me ask you something that I've been thinking about. What does this do to cities? Like, if robotaxis are cheap enough and available enough, does that change how cities are built?
Oh man, this is the rabbit hole. So yes, potentially in huge ways. Think about parking. If autonomous vehicles are just circulating, picking someone up, dropping them off, picking up the next person, you don't need nearly as much parking, and parking takes up an enormous amount of urban real estate. Some estimates say 30% or more of land in American cities is devoted to parking.
30%? That's insane.
It is insane. So if you can reclaim even a fraction of that, you're talking about massive potential for housing, parks, commercial space. It could reshape city centres in ways we can barely imagine right now. But, and this is the flip side, cheap autonomous rides could also accelerate sprawl. If the ride is cheap and you can work during the commute, suddenly living an hour outside the city isn't as painful. So you might get more development in exurbs and more pressure on open land.
So it could go either way. Denser cities or more sprawl, depending on how it plays out.
Exactly. And there's a real risk that it competes with public transit. If a robotaxi ride is cheap enough, why take the bus? That sounds great for the individual rider, but it could drain ridership and funding from transit systems that serve people who can't afford even a cheap robotaxi. There are real equity concerns here.
Has any city tried to get ahead of this with regulation or planning?
Some are starting to. San Francisco's had a pretty active regulatory approach, sometimes too active depending on who you ask. They delayed Cruise and Waymo permits multiple times. There's been tension between the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, and the city government about who has authority. It's messy. But at least they're engaging with it. A lot of cities haven't even started thinking about it.
And what about the international picture? Is this just an American thing, or is it happening elsewhere?
China's actually ahead in some respects. Baidu's Apollo Go service is operating in multiple Chinese cities, Wuhan, Beijing, Shenzhen. They're reportedly doing huge numbers of rides. And the regulatory environment in China is, shall we say, more streamlined. The government can basically just decide to allow it, and it happens. There isn't the same patchwork of local regulations and NIMBY opposition that you get in the US.
That's an advantage in speed, but maybe not in safety oversight.
That's the trade-off. And we don't have great independent safety data from the Chinese operations, so it's hard to compare directly. But the point is, this isn't just Waymo in a few American cities. This is a global technology shift happening on multiple continents simultaneously.
So zooming out, if you had to put a timeline on this, when does the average person in a major US city have access to a robotaxi?
I think within 5 years, most top 20 US metro areas will have some form of commercial robotaxi service available, whether it's Waymo or a competitor. The technology's proven, the regulatory framework is developing, and the economics are converging. The question isn't really if anymore. It's how fast and who captures the market.
And for people who own their own cars, does car ownership just slowly decline?
Eventually, yeah, but that's a longer timeline, maybe 15 to 20 years before you see a major shift. Car ownership is deeply cultural in America. People love their cars. It's tied to identity, freedom, independence. Even if a robotaxi is cheaper and more convenient, a lot of people aren't going to give up their car willingly. It'll probably start with second cars. Families that have 2 cars might realise they only need one if robotaxis can fill the gaps.
That makes sense. The second car in the driveway that barely gets used.
Right. The average American car sits parked 95% of the time. It's one of the most inefficient assets most people own. If robotaxis can absorb even some of those trips, the economics of owning a second vehicle stop making sense pretty fast.
All right, last question. What's the thing about this whole trend that most people are getting wrong? What's the biggest misconception?
I think the biggest misconception is that this is still experimental. People still talk about self-driving cars like they're a prototype or a science project. And I get why. It felt that way for a long time. But Waymo is running a real commercial transportation service at scale, in multiple cities, with no safety drivers, carrying tens of thousands of people every single day. That's not an experiment, that's an industry. And I think a lot of people, including a lot of people in the auto industry and in government, haven't fully internalized what that means yet. By the time they do, the landscape might already look completely different.
It's one of those things where the future arrived and most people didn't notice because there was no single dramatic moment. It just kind of accumulated.
Perfectly put, it accumulated, and now we're here.
Well, on that note, Matt, thanks for going deep on this one. Really fascinating stuff.
Always fun. This one's going to age interestingly. I think we should revisit it in a year and see where the numbers are.
Deal. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll catch you next time.